Hi there. As his family and the Kofi Annan Foundation announced on Saturday, former Secretary General of the United Nations Kofi Annan has died at the age of 80 after a short illness. He was the first UN chief from sub-Saharan Africa, and he dedicated his life to the cause of world peace and development. Leaders and politicians from all over the world have been paying tribute and mourning his passing. What are Kofi Annan's legacies to the United Nations and the world? What were the high points and the regrets of his career? And how should we evaluate his contributions to world diplomacy? To honor this outstanding diplomat and UN leader, I'm glad to be joined in the Beijing studio by Hua Liming, guest research fellow of the China Institute of International Studies, and Madame He Wenping, senior research fellow at the Chahar Institute, a think tank in China. We shall also cross over to Beatrice Marshall, who is based in Nairobi. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our studio discussion here. We do miss his smiles and all the outstanding achievements. What kind of diplomat or important personality does Kofi Annan go down history?
He knows how to deal with superpower, how to deal with the big fives in the United Nations. And he always is standing with the weaks, the small and medium countries. So he is I think he's a professional diplomat in the history of the United Nations. He can deal with the United States because for 7 decades, United Nations actually is dominated by the United States. Any Secretary General who is working against, not in favor of the United States, will be kicked out, like Petrus Ghali, his predecessor, only served 1 term. But Kofi Annan, he was very professional to deal with the United States. Even the United States was unhappy with him, with his behaviors and his working in the United States, United Nations. So I think he's professional, and his spirit of making peace. Really, we appreciate his spirit of making peace and his contribution to many issues of the United Nations, especially during the eras that is after the end of the Cold War and the unilateralism. For 1 decade, the United States was the only superpower in the world. So his job was extremely difficult to deal all these big powers and to working for peace and development, as you said.
Kofi Annan has impressed the rest of the world with a warm character, and of course there is a strong character in his career development as the UN chief. So what do you think of the achievements and regrets of this important person?
Well, yes, I think he has a very charming personality. When you look about all his pictures there, you can read at least 2 kinds of personality. One is very calmness, and also determination. And also another is he also bold enough to challenge all those so-called very superpower when he found that is the right thing he needs to do. So I think in terms of to see what kind of achievements or regrets he has done in the whole those 10 years, I think the biggest one maybe that is he has made this Millennium Development Goal, MDGs. So when he was in the year 2000. And also this is highly relates with his home continent, that is Africa, because for anti-poverty, for the development, this has been guiding the UN's development in the long time until 2015. Now has been replaced with the SDGs, that is Sustainable Development Goals. But before it's MDGs is charting the road forward. And the second is, I think he also made a very bold announcement. That is, he said that Iraqi war is illegal. It's illegal because that war has been taken place, by the United States, by the Bush administration by that time. But unfortunately, and when the Kofi Annan was Secretary of the UN, at that time he couldn't, even though he spent all those efforts, but he couldn't stop this illegal war. but he made that opening, saying this is the thing he feels very regret he couldn't to prevent this war happening. He also feels very sorry for those lost of those lives in those war in Iraqi, and also including a lot of UN, those peoples based in Iraqi headquarters there. They also sacrificed. So all those two things, I think, one shows his sympathy, like a Millennium Development Goal, his sympathy, he devoted himself to the poverty, reduction. Another shows his peace loving. Yeah, he don't like to see those like power politics, those use of the force to determine those, to trying to resolve those things, because a lot of hotspots there. But in order to resolve those conflicts, it's not saying who has the nuclear button, who has those very supreme power, especially military power, you can resolve things. But actually in his governance time, he established two new intergovernmental those bodies. One is called this peace making council. Another is called this human rights council. He devoted to human rights, like trying to motivate those civil society and NGOs to get involved in those world affairs, those debates. So this is the thing he has been done. So I think all this has given him this global respect for his contribution, for his idea, and also for his effort.
For a while, Kofi Annan may have thought that with the end of the Cold War, it's time to discuss development instead of peace. Hence, peace has been prioritized during his administration. Now, our condolences, of course, go to his family members who has just lost their beloved ones. And at the same time, I have to share with our audience my rare experience of conducting an exclusive interview with Kofi Annan 3 years ago. Let's take a quick look at the video.
I think when you look at the world today, the question people ask is, we have conflicts all over, and the organization was set up to ensure that we do not go through wars and to save populations from the ravages of war. And yet when you look around us, from Middle East to Africa to Ukraine, there are many wars. And yet when you look at it in historic terms, there are fewer wars today than in the past. There are hardly any wars between major powers. And in terms of percentages, fewer people are dying today than in the past. But that requires the UN also to strengthen its capacities and the member states to work with the organization for us to have a much more effective impact on these conflicts which are spilling around us. But the nature of conflicts have also changed. I said there are fewer interstate wars, but you have many more civil wars. And civil wars not necessarily between organized groups, sometimes with the government on one side and groups of militia on the other.
He was lamenting conflicts, regional and ethnic divisions in the post-Cold War era. My colleague, Beatrice Marshall, host of an African station in Nairobi, was also able to interview Kofi Annan. Let's take a quick look.
I interacted with the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan on several occasions, particularly since 2008 at the height of Kenya's post-election violence. He came out as a soft-spoken man, but with a will of steel. He was instrumental at the time in getting the peace process of Kenya going. I was a journalist covering much of the post-election violence that had engulfed Kenya at that time. In 2012, after he retired, he was a board member of the Alliance for a Green Revolution for Africa. I interviewed him in Arusha in Tanzania at an Agra forum. He was very passionate about Africa's agricultural revolution and food security for Africa. He was instrumental in finding a solution to Africa's food security challenges, as well as women empowerment on the continent. Africa will remember him for his peace efforts for the continent. He was in all of Africa's hotspots, mediating peace, giving solutions and ensuring that there was a stable Africa. But it is the post-election violence in 2008 and the unity government that will be a landmark for Kofi Annan. It was here on these grounds in 2008 that a solution was finally found for Kenya's post-election crisis, mediated by the former UN Secretary General.
He was quoted as saying that retirement is actually hard work. He said so during an interview with the BBC. What do you think of his life in retirement, Ambassador Hua?
A figure like Kofi Annan really is needed, not only by the United Nations, by the world community. So after his retirement, I think still he was needed after 60, and even much more he was needed by the world community to mediate the Syrian war, to mediate the Myanmar issues, and even other issues he was asked to do. So he said retirement is a hard work. Really, to my personal experience was too, where it's a hard work, but I feel happy because I'm needed by the society. I'm called by different medias, by different meetings. Really, I feel I'm needed. Because many people, after retirement, they will feel they are no more needed people. But figures like Kofi Annan, he's not. He's much more needed by the world community.
Very much like Jimmy Carter, former U.S. president. He wasn't able to have a very positive comment during his presidency, but he served as special envoy of the United States on many occasions, like his journey to the DPRK, to Haiti, to Bosnia. So what do you think, and Cuba? What do you think of politicians and diplomats after they retire? Yeah,
recently I had the lucky to join a conference organized by Carter Center in the Djibouti. So after that the conference has been wrapped up, all the participants have been given a book written by President Jimmy Carter. So I read the first page, the preface. It was very interesting. Jimmy Carter said, some correspondent asked me, what is my happiest time during my long careers in White House or leave the White House? He said, certainly after the White House, after I leave the White House. So that means after he left the White House, now he has no those burdens on his shoulder, but he can make full use of those reputation he has gained in his the presidency, and then to make them, to trying to use them to influence other people in the world. Like Carter Center has done a lot of activities, either the workshop or like the real things has been handling in the grassroots.
Let me bring you back to our discussion about the Kofi Annan. What about a comparison, if you could, a parallel one, between Dr. Boutros-Ghali, his predecessor, Ban Ki-moon, his successor, and the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres from Portugal? Are there any similarities or differences?
I wouldn't say, I cannot compare these figures in the United Nations, but I would say Kofi Annan is the smartest one among the Secretary General. You see, since 70 years before United Nations was established, it's an unwritten law in the United Nations that all the nominations of Secretary General should be first approved by the United States. At least this nominee cannot be an anti-US one. So the system is rotating from Europe to Asia to Latin America to Africa. But some of these people, they was not smart enough. They didn't know how to deal with the superpower. Like the Kofi Annan's predecessor, Boutros-Ghali, he only served one term because he offended the United Nations, U.S. position. But Kofi Annan was very smart. He was so cautious during his first term and tried to avoid any offense against the United States.
But he was voted back into the office unanimously for the second term, despite the loggerheads that
you see the procedure of the election of Secretary General is first is discussion, consultation among Big Fives. If one of these Big Five vetoed and the nominee is denied, especially the United Nations.
Let's hear his personal account about what was going on between him and the United States. And he spoke of this issue during my interview that took place 3 years ago. Let's take a look. Why you were put under severe scrutiny in the relationship with the oil for food scandal, quote unquote. Of course, you were cleared and the case was closed and you felt quite relieved, but those were your darkest days. You were singled out as a scapegoat because you criticized a superpower. Looking back, what do you want to say to those who are still concerned as to the treatment you got as the Secretary General in the last remaining days of your office?
Yeah. No, first of all, let me say it's good you raised that question. When that campaign was going on, which obviously was started by dark forces in Washington, it became clear when the investigation was concluded that if there was a scandal, the scandal was not in New York, the scandal was not at the UN, the scandal was in the capitals. It was a businessman from the US, UK, Australia and others who made deals with Saddam Hussein and paid bribes to get contracts. It was the US and UK and others who had imposed a no-fly zone in Iraq, who watched oil smuggle to Jordan and Turkey in billions without saying anything. So to try and pin it on the UN, which organized the oil for food. So for them, in order to undermine me in the UN, to turn the oil for food against the UN was unpardonable. What I was happy about is most member states understood what was going on, and they knew it was a deliberate campaign and did not believe it. And you may have to go to the archives and check once. After that, I had gone to speak to the General Assembly, which normally doesn't get up and give standing ovations. They stood up and gave me a long standing ovation, which was their answer to what the US was trying to do to me and to the organization.
Now, the issue is not only about his personal chemistry with the United States, the sole superpower in the wake of the Cold War, but also the Rwanda massacre that took place in the early 1990s, namely in 1994. So what do you think of, what do you think of his role? Because he was the Under-Secretary General in charge of peace-making missions, but he was accused of doing nothing to prevent the massacre before it was too late.
Yeah, that's exactly the thing he has been doing when he has become the Secretary General. That is the UN reform. Because before, his predecessor, like Boutros Ghali, has been accused from the United Nations. This is the biggest member in the UN, saying the UN now is, very slow, not efficiency, and cannot make a very, accurate response or faster response to all the situations in the world. And so, after Kofi Annan becoming the boss of the UN, so he has to do this UN reform, but he has done already also and make it very successful. So he streamlined all those different departments in the UN, because according to the Guterres, the sitting UN Secretary, he said Kofi Annan is United States. He mentioned this. According to my understanding, is because Kofi Annan himself, he grown up even himself, developed his capacity in the UN system, because he entered into UN ever since 1962. So gradually started from the very, grass, the lowest level, and then gradually promoted. So he knows the system very well. That's why he can do this reform.
Back to Rwanda.
Yeah, after this, I'm going to that. After this reform, and then this, because this Rwanda time, 1994, at that time this UN system wasn't that fast response and couldn't make any quick response to the genocide in Rwanda. And also by that time, UN, I don't think it's totally quite independent, has been influenced by lots of big different
lobby groups.
Those power politic, similar like when the Syria crisis is there, and Kofi Annan has been appointed as special envoy again, but soon he quit. He said, I couldn't do my job to, help this Syria crisis become out of the crisis, simply because again he found a lot of big players coming from the UN, and then they have different interests. So make his job saying this is a mission impossible to do this Syria crisis mediation. But in that time, back to the 1994, almost the similar situation happening. So because the United States now no longer wants to get involved in Africans, those hot spots, and after they suffered from Somali crisis. So they don't want to get in, don't want to offer the help hand. So how could the UN do? So UN at that time also is like
now, is it true, Ambassador Hua, that the United Nations has been a talking shop where it could only pay lip service without enacting, without being able to take real actions? Now, that comes to the issue of how he looks at China. He says China is, of course, one of the P5, and China should have played a far larger role. China is, of course, symbol of a representation of developing countries and emerging markets, not only in the UN Security Council, but in the world body of the United Nations as a general. So what do you think of his comments on China and the margin for China's diplomatic and political maneuver at this, on the center stage of world affairs?
I wouldn't say it's a talking shop. But the reality is that the United Nations is not a global government. United Nations doesn't have authority to order the nations of the world to do something or not to do something. Just as the issue like the issue of Rwanda massacre and many wars in the world, United Nations and the Security Council could pass a number of resolutions, but none of these resolutions could be implemented because nations have their own sovereignties, and the United Nations doesn't have the authority over the nations. And the other factor is that the invisible domination of the United States. We have to recognize the headquarters is in New York, and the United States want the United Nations to be a tool, instrument of the U.S. foreign policy. It's a clear reality. So every Secretary General who doesn't serve the U.S. interests will be kicked out by the United Nations.
Meanwhile, China is accused of being assertive when we grow so fast economically, when China has its rapid expansion of the world stakes. Without China's support, many people don't think that Ban Ki-moon, the diplomat from South Korea, our neighboring country, would have been made or appointed Secretary General to succeed Kofi Annan. What do you think of the role China plays? Kofi Annan came over to China 7 times, both in office and after he had retired. What do you think of the role China could play in shaping the course of the world development?
Well, China is one of the members in the UN Security Council. So we have been constantly give our whole support to the UN to build on this authority rather than to weakening this authority. Now I think, to be frankly, Trump administration, they don't want to see this UN becoming stronger or stronger. A lot of decisions has been made by the US government just to kick out of the UN, just go around by themselves, like airstrike to Syria last year. So I think China has taken a completely different approach. We want to see this authority being built on and on for the UN. And also, don't forget, we are becoming the #1 peacekeeper provider in the UN Security Council. And also, since I think 2 years ago, we are becoming the second biggest peacekeeping fund provider to the UN peacekeeping missions. Before, that was Japan is the second provider, but now according to the new round of every 3 years, we have a new counting according to the GDP. So now China becoming the second biggest. And also, I think 2 years ago, like when President Xi Jinping joined the 70th UN Assembly, and then also made a big announcement saying China will to build 8,000 those peacekeepers standby, peacekeeping troops. And last year, our defense ministry has made an announcement saying already made this 8,000
yes, China is one of the P5 and can make important contributions to the development of Africa. Look at the achievements of President Xi Jinping through the latest tour that took him to 4 African countries. The other issue is he never bothered to conceal his disagreement and even disputes that he had with China. For example, on the issue of human rights. He is the UN chief who said the issue of human rights knows no boundary. But China says you have to take into consideration the importance of sovereignty. It means that China opposes any overseas intervention with internal affairs, such as human rights. What do you think of such disputes that he raised with the Chinese authorities?
Yes, I do respect his personality because he's an independent nomination. Kofi Annan, if you noted his biography, he was educated in the United States. He has his college education.
And his country, Ghana, was a British colony.
Yes.
So he grew up
when he was born.
British colony.
Ghana was still under the colony of Britain. So he was educated by the British and by the American cultures. So it's natural that he has his views, points of human rights, his values associated to the West. So I think that it's natural, and I don't blame him personally.
Your point of view.
Oh yes, because his idea like responsibility to protect this R2P also has been widely discussed, debated during his, when he's serving as the Secretary of State. Why he put forward this idea like focus on responsibility to protect? Because he got those lessons, strongly lessons from Rwanda genocide. Because 1994 Rwanda genocide, and then the whole international society just to watch. Nobody come to offer a help hand. So he draw a great lesson from that genocide. That's why he pushed for this idea, like a responsibility to protect. So seems like a lot of discussion, like academic papers has mentioned this one R2P has been highly fit with like even put like humanitarian rights should be stands above the sovereignty rights. So this is a debate. I think this is different idea, but idea itself, I don't think it's anything wrong. But all those beautiful ideas, you have to fit with those cases, different cases. So different cases, they have different scenario.
Yes, indeed, the appeal and the charm, attractions of the United Nations as a world body are characterized very much by the broad spectrum of diversified public opinions. China represents, of course, those opinions of developing countries. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue, and we pay tribute to Kofi Annan, late Secretary General of the United Nations. I'll see you next time.